feet of clay going on here. Musk doesn't have that magic source that Apollo had. When I asked head of the Harwell Atomic Energy Research outfit here in the UK a few years back, when she gave a lecture to the British Interplanetary Society, I said, how did Apollo avoid the problems with radiation which we now know exist in space? And her answer was the luck of Apollo. Now, obviously, Musk doesn't have that secret source, so he's designing all sorts of weird rockets that have huge weight restrictions with this water or the stainless steel or whatever he wants to use, because he acknowledges what you've identified very clearly. There are problems with radiation in space.
That's what particularly gave me the hope that this guy was fair dinkum. He was literally quoting everything that I said in my video response to him. He obviously saw the video, and I figured, okay, he's rectifying his problem. He's going to solve these issues. He's going to make sure that we have this kind of radiation shield. Instead, he just, we've got a solar storm shelter. Now let's forget all about that now for now. I just talk about something else, giving money for contracts.
Given the fact that they're acknowledging that there's more severe radiation there, let's take it back to the film. You see all of those numbers that they're sitting there. How could the actual film in the cameras record anything if there is that much radiation? I mean, even on the trip there, and it's capable of traveling right through the vehicle. And not only that, because it's aluminum, it's actually even more excited in many different ways. All of that is going to affect the film.
And Apollo used film, not digital.
That's right.
These solar storm shelters, are they on Mars or the moon or both?
Well, the idea was that it was supposed to be on the spacecraft. It was going to be on the spacecraft basically going there.
Oh my God, look at this. Okay, Mars transit configuration, and this is the same one that they're using for the moon, 40 cabins and large common areas plus solar storm shelter.
That's what he was claiming. He was claiming it was going to be on the spacecraft to there and back. I assume, based on what Mars 1 was proposing, was that they were going to have basically bases buried under tons of Mars soil. Okay, for the trip there, you'd have the solar storm shelter. When you're on Mars or they're on the moon, you would have the base covered up in the dirt, so you don't have to worry about the radiation that way. He never unveiled it. I waited and waited and waited for years, waiting for him to unveil, explain what this shielding consists of. Is it adequate? Is it any good? I mean, what are you proposing? What kind of shield are you proposing to use?
Yeah, see, what he has here is he just has it listed as a solar storm shelter. He says 40 cabins and large common areas, central storage, a galley, and solar storm shelter. And when you read onto this, it says, well, it could take up to 250 passengers, but more around 100 people. And then you read the article, you don't see anything that is going to help with the radiation inside of that storm shelter. They don't mention water. They don't mention their now fancy boron nitride nanotubes and all those other things. So you don't see any of this. It shows the ship laying on its side, right out in the open. And this is supposed to filter all this harmful radiation out. And then they have another one on Mars. Same thing. It's sitting on its side with 40 windows.
Yeah, but like I said, if he's building storm shelters, don't you think he'd build some for Kansas? They got enough tornadoes there. Make a bit of money selling it off there.
Yeah, and I think that was proposed as early as the Apollo Applications Program. There was some proposals to basically use the S4B stages as a makeshift moon base. Obviously, those Apollo application proposals never got off the ground. And in fact, the only Apollo Applications project to see fruition was, of course, Skylab and Apollo Soyuz. And in fact, you guys were talking about the Apollo telescope mount on the previous show. I mentioned in the comments the Apollo telescope mount. Originally, what they're proposing to do was they would have a lunar orbit-only version of the Apollo spacecraft, the Apollo LEM, basically with no descent stage, but a big telescope put in its place, which they would use for during the orbital-only missions. This was part of the Apollo Applications project. When those were cancelled, they got repurposed for Skylab, the Apollo telescope mount thing.
I guess what people really need to understand about rocket technology, one of the most basic things is the energy's in the fuel. It's not in the rocket engine itself. The rocket engine simply transfers that energy and directs it. And of course, the efficiency at which it's doing that at is the only thing that's in a rocket design. But the energy itself is in the fuel. You can't multiply that by changing the rocket design.
There's another thing as well when it comes to this whole Artemis III thing, which was why this SpaceX thing was just such a pipe dream. When they first unveiled this interplanetary transport system, whatever he wants to call it, he was proposing a refueling mission. The early cartoons and animations that they had, they all showed just the one capsule docking with the original, basically refilling it. But then later they would say, oh, we would need 4 tanker missions to fill it up. It actually turned out they would need closer to 20 tanker missions just to make up for the propellant that was lost on boil-off. Just for comparison's sakes, the rockets that von Braun was proposing back in the 50s, where they would have a big ring station and they would basically ferry astronauts from the station to the moon and then back to the station again. He was proposing rendezvous refueling as well, but he was proposing hypergolic propellants. They're basically these chemicals that you keep in the tanks indefinitely, and when you want to, light up the engine, you just put them together and boom, they react spontaneously, like lemon juice and baking soda. You're not going to have those luxuries with liquid oxygen and liquid methane, because these cryogenic propellants, they can only be kept in liquid form for a few hours before they start to boil and turn it back into a gas. They turn it back into a gas and they have to be vented out of the spacecraft, otherwise it'll blow. Keep in mind as well, they can only launch 5 Starship rockets from the Boca Chica launch site. Given the launch restrictions in mind and the amount of boil-off you would get, you would literally need 20 missions just to fill up the tanks, just to send it out to the moon. At least with von Braun's proposal, the idea was to send the craft from Earth orbit to the moon and then back to Earth orbit again. With this Artemis program, they're proposing about keeping the lander in lunar orbit. Well, if it took 20 tanker missions just to send the damn thing out to the moon in the first place, how are you going to get all the tanker missions to lunar orbit just to refuel it? For each tanker mission, that would mean each of those tanker missions would require another 20 missions or so just to send it. It's just not a viable option.
The one thing on the Apollo missions, that's why they had a helium tank on board, which was to pressurize the fuel tanks to keep them in liquid form. Even as it's being expended, they wanted to keep it in that liquid form. The helium tank that went missing, when they put the rover in there and it disappeared, that's the tank I was talking about.
Well, I think the Apollo spacecraft themselves, they used the hypergolics.
And they still had to keep them in liquid form.
Yeah, but the hypergolics, they don't have the problem of boil off like they do with cryogenic, okay?
They're using it at the same time when they're doing that. If it's going to boil, it's going to come out.
I'd have to look into the specifics on that one. I haven't looked at that in a while. But what I understand is that the hypergolics, they don't have the boiler fiasco because they're not kept at cryogenic temperatures, whereas the liquid propellants are. It's kind of in the name. You need sub-zero temperatures just to keep them liquid. The melting point of oxygen is something like negative 200 something or other Celsius. Yeah. The melting point of oxygen is negative 218.8 Celsius. Methane is negative 182 Celsius for methane. Hydrogen is negative 259.1 Celsius. So basically on the ground, when they're preparing for the launch pad, they got all these air conditioning units to keep it liquid. In fact, when you actually see, it looks like steam seeping down the side of the spacecraft. That's actually the oxygen and the hydrogen they're actually venting out the spacecraft. It's so cold that it actually freezes all the water vapor in the air around it. You see it as the gas that's falling back down to the surface.
They've taken the bottom section off there, used a crane to lower it down onto its side. Then what they did was they built it up. They put a bunch of moon dust all the way around it. I have another one showing how they buried it. But the funny thing is they only bury it up to the windows. So the windows are allowing all of that cosmic radiation and everything else in.
I keep away from the windows.
Yeah, you think they would do that? You think they would either do something with the windows or put something in the glass, anything but to keep the windows exposed.
Yeah, I think ESA, they had a proposal for something similar. They would actually have an airlock. They would have this big igloo-like base, and they would have an airlock, basically with the door sticking out of the big anthill they've built, covering all this dust, something similar anyway. It looks like a wet workshop concept to me, in which they would basically use the spent rocket stage basically as a space station module, or in this case, a moon-based module. Yeah,
that's exactly what it looks like. In this case, they don't show you the windows at the top like they do on the other one.
Well, that one looks like purely a unmanned craft that they've just basically repurposed into a station module. Like I said, a wet workshop. There's 2 ways of making a space station, or in this case, a moon base. One is the tri-workshop, which where you got the space station already pre-assembled and you just launch that straight into space. Whereas a wet workshop, you basically can take the spent rocket stage and then you basically convert that into your space station once all the propellants have been used up.
Strange though what they have. It says how to horizontalize a starship. This does not look like a starship. At the back of it, I only count 2 or 3 engines back there.
It might be an earlier draft of the thing. It's only the lower stage that has like 33 engines, whereas the upper stage is something like 6 or 9 engines, if I recall correctly. They had so many different revisions of the Starship.
You see, what's strange to me is that if the N1 failed 4 times, it exploded. Why would you take a concept like that and then build on it 60 years later? It doesn't make sense when they've tried it and tried it and tried it and it doesn't work. You could put all the computers you want on it. I think you're going to have more problems. I looked at it the same with a car engine. How simple it was back then, but then you take that same engine and you start adding cam phasers, variable valve timing, all that kind of stuff in there. And it just breaks down even faster.
Based on these early proposals, he wanted to have 9 of these Raptor engines on the Starship, on the Super Heavy to begin with. Originally, they were Merlin 2 engines, which never got built. Now he was proposing Raptors. But if you look at the actual proposals and what was actually developed, what I think happened was the Raptor was supposed to be something comparable in size to the F1, but obviously it had to be scaled back into something much, much smaller. And so to deliver comparable thrust, they needed to put many, many engines on the first stage and basically repeat the N1. That was the most bitter pill to swallow for me, because back in 2010, when they unveiled the Falcon 20, essentially they were proposing a modern-day equivalent of the Nova rockets or the UR-700 rockets. What they delivered was the modern-day equivalent of the N1. And even that's being too generous, because the N1 was intended to go into Earth orbit. This one can't even reach Earth orbit. It struggles to do suborbits.
Well, it's pretty good blowing up.
It's one expensive firework, I will say.
That diagram, how they are going to lay that rocket down on there, and then they've got that nice little machine that's completely autonomous and that's going to build everything for them. That's right at fantasy land right now.
I was just checking out the propulsion of the Raptor engine, how much it puts out in terms of power when compared to the F1. As far as I remember, I think that the Raptor is about 200,000 pounds of thrust, unless they quote it in newtons.
The Raptor engine produces 408,000 pounds of thrust. And for comparison, the F1 engine produces 1.5 million. That's a lot more.
Yeah.
SpaceX was planning something similar, hence why they were considering only 6 to 9 engines in the Falcon 20. And what they ended up doing was something much, much smaller, and they needed 33 engines to deliver comparable thrust. It was the same case with what happened on the N1. They had no equivalent to the F1 engine, so they had to make do with 30 smaller engines. And it's often been described as a plumber's nightmare, and that's no exaggeration, because you think of all the tubing that they had to put in these things. It's an accident waiting to happen.
Yeah. So if the F1 engine, which was originally developed, the late 1950s, the work started on it with Rocketdyne. If the F1 engine could allegedly produce the 1.5 million pounds of thrust on a design that is obviously made with slide rules rather than computers, can't that design be resurrected? Is there a technological failure in the F1 engine that it didn't actually work to the extent that we're told it did? For the story of Apollo to be real, the F1 engine had to work. If the F1 engine didn't work at the level we're told it did, the whole Apollo story falls apart, because it all relies on the F1 engine.
I find it interesting they keep saying that, well, we've destroyed the technology for Apollo. Well, what about the ones that you got on display? There's the famous pictures of the Saturn rocket laid horizontally at, I think it was at the Kennedy Space Center. We've all seen those pictures. Speaking from personal experience down here in Sydney, Australia, if you go to the Powerhouse Museum, they have a specific space section, okay, and you can literally walk underneath the F1 engine. I've actually been there many times as a kid and growing up. It's very, very spectacular to see. It puts into perspective the huge scale of the engine. Okay, if you've got these engines on display, why not just try to reverse engineer that? You think that would have been the first step.
Well, Bezos dragged one up out of the ocean. They rebuilt it and test fired it. You can even see the video of the test firing of it. They didn't say that they were bringing it up to full throttle on the thing, but it was rebuilt and test fired. If they can rebuild what he dragged out of the ocean after 50 years, they can certainly make one from scratch. I don't think they ever worked anywhere close to that. I've listened to Musk sit there going, well, he was going to take his, and they were at 220 pounds of thrust or 1,000 pounds of thrust, and he's going to make them 600,000 because he's got this special fuel and everything else like that. And then, of course, once you get up into that thrust capability, the engines are cannibalizing themselves. They're just burning right up. And the fuel consumption, like I say, the energy's in the fuel, not the engine. That's why an F1 engine is physically that size.
There was something in a book, I think it was by Deborah Cadbury, if I recall correctly. It was called SpaceX. They actually made a docudrama miniseries on the BBC based on a book called Space Race. She mentioned somewhere in there that there was no celebration of solving the F1 engine's combustion stability problem. What they did was they had something called Project First, where they would basically plant explosive devices inside the engine bell, basically set them off and see if it handled those very well. Ultimately, von Braun, he had to build the engines on the hope that they would work. There was never any assurance that the problem was solved, from what I recall correctly. Bill Casing mentioned in his book, he reckoned that rather than using the F1 engines, they basically substituted them with the H1 engines that they had on the Saturn 1B. Basically, they use those basically disguised with the engine bell. They don't produce as much thrust as the Saturn V's F1 engines. Obviously, that would mean no mission to the moon because you're not producing enough thrust. You'd have to lighten the load accordingly, if I recall correctly, lighten the amount of propellant in the upper stages and whatnot, and try to get that into Earth orbit.
And if they can get it into orbit, which is probably possible, then from then on, it's just down to NASA to tell us what's going to happen next. Now, if they'd done a real-time, an Apollo 11 8-day simulation of the whole mission, they had it all on tape. They just needed a computer to drive the tape at the correct speed and do the correct commentary, which is what they had in the IBM 360, which was delivered to NASA in the mid-1960s.
I was just going to say, and of course they had a proof of concept as to how to fake a mission to the moon such that the people on the outside would be convinced. This is the quote from Pavel Popovich. When we realized we would never make it to the moon, we decided to engage in a little bit of hooliganism. We asked our engineers to link the on-the-probe receiver to the transmitter with a jumper wire. Moon flight missions were controlled from the command center in Yevpatoria in the Crimea. When Zonda 5 was on its path around the moon, I was at the center, so I took the mic and said, "The flight is proceeding according to normal. We're approaching the surface." Second later, my reports, as if from outer space, was received on the Earth, including by the Americans. The U.S. space advisor, Frank Borman, got a phone call from President Nixon. It was actually President Johnson. His memory seems to be in error. Got a phone call from President Johnson who asked, "Why is Popovich reporting from the moon?" My joke caused real turmoil. In about a month's time, Frank came to the USSR and I was instructed to meet him at the airport. Hardly had he walked out of his plane when he shook his fist at me and said, "Hey, you space hooligan."
Yep, that's a famous quote, that one.
Quite the accusation to be throwing around, considering that he was on the first mission supposedly around the moon and back, that Frank Borman.
It's because Russians are very good chess players. They know how to maneuver. They know how to maneuver their opponent correctly on a chessboard, and they can do it in real life too. That Zon 5 flight really put the frighteners on NASA, which is why they launched Apollo 8 so rapidly against the advice of James Webb, who was furious when he found out they'd launched, because he wasn't there. He didn't make the decisions.
I think Sir Bernard Lavelle also had some serious concerns about that as well, because they hadn't had an unmanned test flight around the moon and back. He was concerned about the G-forces associated with the re-entry from lunar orbit would have been enough to kill the astronauts. He was really concerned about that, and then suddenly, problem's gone away. Never mind.
Well, of course, if Apollo 8 was only in low Earth orbit, the re-entry gravitational effect wouldn't be so high.
Exactly. Now, I see, Robert, you sent this other picture here. I see what you're talking about now here. They put windows on these space station modules.
Every one of the
Tesla
vehicles
trucks.
is a Cybertruck.
Oh, my Lord. That's a death trap waiting to happen. I'm sure you saw in the news just recently that 3 teens crashed their car, crashed the Cybertruck, and they ended up going up in flames. You want to know why it goes up in flames? That car is literally the motor car equivalent of Apollo 1. Elon Musk, in his infinite wisdom, he decided to have powered door latches, these door handles, which obviously require the battery to function correctly. When you crash the car, the first thing that usually goes is the battery, which basically renders those doors inoperable, so you can't get the door open. And if the thing's going up in flames, break the window. You're going to go up in flames otherwise.
Well, I used to call them coffins. Now I call them crematorians. And I was just wondering if you get a discount because you're already there if you buy one of those vehicles. One of the biggest problems, not only does the door not open because everything's electronic, the side windows are laminated the same as the front windshield. So if somebody comes up to you in an accident and they're trying to help you out of the vehicle, they have as much trouble. Like, it's not like a regular side window. It's the same as the front windshield. All of the windows are like that.
Yeah.
And that's in their cars as well now.
And here again, this is SpaceX's first lunar base. Now, what did they do? Look at all the glass that they put in this thing, and then they only put so much of the structure on it that's going to deflect all of the radiation or absorb it or whatever. You see, just like Jarrah said, it has to look good. That's the very first thing that he goes for, is looks. He doesn't care how it functions. It has to look good.
Look
that
at the
huge?
PDF file that updated the windows. They're
Windows
putting
that-
aluminum in the windows, which makes the radiation even worse because they added the aluminum to the windows. Not only that, but it makes the window glass very brittle.
I was just going to add as well, there's a reason why on actual spacecraft they have only just a porthole. You would never have windows like that on a moon base, right? Because it's putting much more pressure on all these different frames around it. This mismatch of frames basically holding the windows there. Not so much pressure you're putting on the windows. One of them's going to pop out sooner or later, right? You don't want to have windows like that on a spacecraft. That's why you have little portholes.
Perhaps we should just look upon Elon Musk as being a modern version of Arthur C. Clarke. He's a science fiction writer, coming up with all these wonderful proposals, some of which may work. Arthur C. Clarke was the first one to suggest the satellite ring around Earth for communications.
The Starlink, you mean? Basically, he basically brought that to life with Starlink. Is that what you're
That's
saying?
right, yeah. Send satellites up so you can communicate more easily. Well, that's a reasonable science fiction concept, which proved its worth in real life. Musk is doing much the same. He's throwing all these ideas out, developing all these ideas. They're not necessarily practical when you start looking into them. And we keep coming back to the problem of radiation. You've examined it in so much detail that assuming Musk is aware of what you're doing, and it appears that he is, then he should start taking notice of it. Or his so-called clever muskrats, who are so good with computers, should be able to work out what the problems are and how to solve them. It's fine to put the problems out there. That's the whole point of science. It's finding the solution to them, which is the hard part. NASA never managed it with Apollo, because now we know it couldn't possibly have happened the way we're told it did. Primarily because of radiation, secondly because of vacuum, and thirdly because of heat. They still haven't solved these problems, and that's where we're stuck. We can't advance.
It's obvious that Musk has seen my videos, as you said, because, like I said, he was quoting literally everything that I said about the radiation coming out the sides because of the magnetic field. He obviously saw my videos. And to think, I literally spent all those years at university, in the hopes of, one day getting a career at SpaceX, put my ideas to good use. Here's what I propose. Here's what I propose we do with your rockets. You got the rockets. I got the know-how to get us past this radiation field. This is what I propose we do. And he turns out to be a complete con artist and oligarch.
Yeah.
That was the most bitter pill to swallow for me.
The idea is there if you're trying to tell a story, but the reality is it's not going to happen. And he has done it in such a way that they go, just like you, go ahead, give it a whirl. Here's some money to do it with. And the problem is you need to develop a new machine to do this because liquid fuel is far too much of a weight penalty. The consumption of it is too much of a penalty. And then, of course, all the consumables that people have to keep them alive for any time of duration in space is a hell of a penalty.
There was another idea as well that came about in 2018. I think it was called Inspiration Mars, where the guy Dennis Tito, the first tourist in space, he was proposing a circa Mars flight, basically a flyby of Mars and back to Earth. He was basically proposing something similar to the Dragon or the Orion spacecraft, and it would have an inflatable living quarters there. The walls would be lined with bags of water that they would use as a radiation shield, and which obviously would use the water for drinking purposes as well. I am not kidding. You literally cannot make this up. Apparently, Dennis Tito can. The idea was, I've drank all the water. Here's the bag. I need to go to the toilet. What should I do? Oh, I know. I'll use the same bag. Basically, do your defecation in the bag and then put it back with all the others on the wall. Use that as a makeshift radiation shield and stuff. And this is probably why he chose a married couple to be the crew, because literally only a person's spouse could tolerate their spouse literally putting their shit on the walls.
Yeah, I've read something about those kind of things. And not only that, using the water as a consumable after you've traveled a certain distance is highly irradiated. All that radiation that it was protecting you from, you're going to now ingest.
The radiation was supposed to be absorbed by this water, but the problem is it's not thick enough. Dennis Tito was proposing about 25 grams per square centimeter of water. No, it needs to be 200 grams per square centimeter of water. Here's a meter. There's about 2 of these. That's how long it's going to be.
They're the weight penalty again.
Exactly. Like I said before, the mistaken position seems to be, if it works for the ISS, it's going to work for interplanetary missions. Well, who writes this stuff? Have they been reading too much of Clavis or Bad Astronomy or something? Because they literally have no clue what they're getting themselves into. These private space exploration proposals, they just don't seem to have a clue what they're talking about.
It's similar back to the days when the land speed record was supposed to be the major achievement, and Craig breedlove, the spirit of America. It was exceeding the speed limit. And so Britain came along and decided to try it again with the rocket engines that they were using. And they got above the speed of sound on land, which is a remarkable achievement. So cars can be developed in relatively short period of time, but spacecraft, not so much. We're still using the liquid-fueled rocket engines to lift spacecraft off Earth against gravity. And we're still trying to work out how to get humans there, because humans, us delicate little creatures that we are, need a lot of protection. Unmanned craft don't. That's why you can send unmanned craft to the moon quite easily and to Mars, because they don't need the same protection and consumables as humans do. Humans are a major problem in space travel. As soon as we eliminate humans from space travel, we'll probably get there a lot faster.
That's why all the missions to the outer solar system have all been unmanned craft. And like I said before, the Juno spacecraft, for example, going back to the solar panel issue, the Juno spacecraft can get away with using solar panels because all it's really powering is just the instruments and the electronics and whatnot, whereas a manned craft would need to power the life support systems, would need to power the communication systems, would need to power all this sort of stuff, which obviously solar panels ain't going to cut it. When you start to look at all the power that you would need, they use radioisotopes on most of these outer solar system missions. And well, you think about how big your power station you're going to need aboard the spacecraft to power everything that they need to keep everybody alive and functioning properly for God only knows how many years you're going to be in space for. There's just no progression of technology, it seems.
My biggest problem is from the day you're born, you're traveling in space. I mean, we are traveling on the nicest spacecraft out there. It's called Earth. And it has everything we need. We can live quite comfortably. It's actually traveling faster through space than we can produce a rocket to travel through space at. And if we're going to physically step off this planet, we basically need to have everything that the Earth provides. And that includes the radiation protection, the Van Allen belt, everything else. It has to have renewable resources if we're going to be in space for any given length of time, just like what the Earth provides. Everything that is here, the power, all of the resources that we have here, we have to transfer, and they're trying to put that in a little tube and shoot it into space. That's where the problem is.
Yeah, it's a good point. Good point, because they haven't really examined it properly in terms of human activity. Yeah, I mean, we can get unmanned craft right through the solar system. In the case of Voyager, probably beyond the solar system. And it still seems to be working, which is quite remarkable, assuming it is. But to get humans even to the moon isn't that far away. You can go at night and have a look at it. It's quite close. Mars is relatively close compared to the outer planets. But the idea of getting humans to the moon, we allegedly did it 60 years ago, and we can't do it today. There's something missing. There's some part of it missing. And all these enthusiasts for NASA, for space travel, I mean, they put out enormous numbers of films pointing out how incredibly advanced NASA is, but they're not showing what the real problems are, because NASA isn't that advanced in terms of space travel. If you look at the time it's taken so far to get from where NASA started in October 58 to where we are today in 2025, you'd think they'd be further advanced. I mean, look at the way cars have come on. The design of cars is completely different now to what it was 50, 60 years ago. They still do the same job. They got 4 wheels and a windscreen, and they still transport people around the place, but in completely different conditions, much safer. You know, cars 50 years ago was like having a 6-inch nail on the steering wheel, the amount of safety there was. And now you can get into really quite serious accidents and walk away from it. Space travel, we allegedly landed on the moon 60 years ago, and they can't get it back near the place.
Exactly.